All right, good morning and welcome to the GFD Airway Management Con Ed for this month. I'm Jonathan Bryant and I have the amazing Chelsea McCoy with me today. I'm working with one of the legacy folk here, okay? It is so much fun to be able to do this and I'm looking forward to it. But Chelsea, I got to get something out the way. I heard that your daddy used to read the AHA manuals to you when you was an infant. Is that true?
No, that's very much a lie. That is, nope. But I've been around it enough to where I can do some stuff verbatim. But yeah, definitely didn't do that shenanigans.
All right, well, then we're in good hands then, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Real quick, guys, just want to say thank you so much to everybody who reached out to us from the last cycle of EMT, all the encouragement that we received and the constructive criticism. We really appreciate that. It just means a lot to us that y'all took the time to let us know and just to give us that support. So thank you. We are still learning, so just buckle up and hold on tight, and we're going to try to do a real good job for you guys today. All right, you ready?
Yes. And also, I'll just say real quick, if you, I highly suggest that you do this with your company. It goes by easier. You don't have to kill 4 birds. You can just kill 1. All right, doing this PowerPoint. Always pause it, stop it, talk about things, talk about what's in your territory, talk about what you all deal with on medical calls. And especially if you have a rookie or if you are a rookie, I highly suggest you do this with someone or with your crew so you can bounce off of each other. Because I know for some of you all, EMT is very, very new. So I highly encourage that you do that together.
All right. All right, so let's get into it. So today, we're going to talk about airway management and patient assessment. Now, we know that the biggest thing that we do out in the field is going to be making sure that our patient doesn't die. And a big component of that is going to be the airway management. One thing that if you pay attention to, if we look at our favorite acronyms, firemen, we like making acronyms for everything. But our favorite one is going to be our ABCs. If you look at that, the main component of the ABCs is going to be dealing with airway. You have airway and breathing. We can bleed for a little while and still, survive. But if we stop breathing for too long, or if we can't breathe, it doesn't really work out that well. As you can see on the slide, it says, that the brain tissue begins to die within roughly 4 to 6 minutes. Now, I'm going to show you guys something in just a little bit in a couple of slides that may challenge that. But everything that you see, even in textbooks, just remember, take it with a grain of salt. That's the stereotypical, that's the average that they found, but there are some amazing human beings out there in the world. I mean, we have a few of them here on the department. Lord Jesus, Rescue 5. I'm always going to shout out 5. So just so you guys know, love you guys. B Shift, y'all are amazing. Hey, so that was my 1 per list. There we go. All right. So let's talk about the whole intricacy of the airway and what's going on with there. Now, we know that oxygen has to reach the body tissue and cells through breathing and circulation, but why is it that we always talk about these two things together? You got any ideas why we talk about these two things together?
You mean breathing and airway?
No, I mean breathing and circulation. Like, why every time we teach, why do we always teach about breathing and circulation? Like, why are those two things interconnected?
Well, we all know that in order for your blood to work, you're going to need oxygen. And in order for you to receive oxygen, your breathing has to be in balance. Your body is all about homeostasis or balance. So if anything is out of balance, especially with circulation and breathing, your body is going to malfunction.
See, there you go. You said it much more eloquently to me. I'm a very simple person. I use a lot of references, so I'm going to simplify it for you. If anybody else is out there like me, I'm going to simplify it for you. So basically, what she's saying is those two systems, the respiratory system and the circulatory system, they have to work hand in hand. When we breathe in, oxygen can only go as far as to our lungs and into our alveoli. Without the circulatory system to put the hemoglobin there to pick up the O2 molecules and to drop off the CO2 molecules, without that, the oxygen never leaves our lungs. So that's why those two systems are absolutely interconnected. So any type of imbalance, if you get out of homeostasis, anything like that, this system just doesn't work. Like I said, she said it better than me. Let's see. All right. So let's get down to the fun stuff. We're going to talk about the anatomy. Now, you guys know, if you've ever been in class with me, I do not get really in depth when it comes to the anatomy because at the end of the day, we are not doctors out in the field. There's only so many things we can do. It is still good for you guys to know it, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it on the anatomy today. That's going to be up to you and your training captains and stuff like that, just to make sure that everybody's up to par. The main thing I want you to know is that we have two parts of the respiratory system. We have the upper and we have the lower. The upper is where we get all the fun sounds and things like, snoring, coughing. We even get boogers. We're going to talk about boogers today. You didn't know that, but we're going to talk about boogers today. It's medically necessary that you have boogers in your life. I found this out. But what I want you to know is that the lower airway is where all the magic happens. And when I say magic, that's where all the exchange happens. We get the O2, we get the CO2, everything, they shake hands and they take place. But we're going to talk all about that. Okay, so we have a couple of these different structures that help us breathe. We got the diaphragm, the chest wall muscles, the accessory muscles, and then we got the nerves and the brain and spinal cord, all that good stuff. But from an EMT standpoint, what's important to us? Well, I'm going to tell you. If we come into a scene as an EMT and we see our patient using the accessory muscles to breathe, that's not necessarily a good thing. Now, there are going to be times where you have people with chronic diseases like COPD or emphysema, where their body has just adapted to having to use their accessory muscles. But when we're looking at it from an acute or a sudden standpoint, that's not good, especially when we're talking about tater tots. Now, I like my tater tots, both food and my little kids. Love them to death. But that's not good when we see them. There's an old rhyme that we learned a long time ago, and I try to bring it up every year just to keep that in everybody's head. But respiratory distress leads to cardiac arrest in pediatric patients. And so when they get into that respiratory distress mode, they're going to use their accessory muscles. Now, Chelsea, give me something that you might see from a pediatric patient having respiratory distress.
So the best way that I could describe this is, how do you feel after you go for a good run? How do you feel after you've completed, for some of y'all, a lot of miles? You start bending over, you start using your whole chest to breathe. All that extra in breathing is using your accessory muscles. So when you see someone who's doing that and they haven't been doing anything, haven't been running, haven't been exercising, what that's the sort of thing you're looking for. Similar to the muscles you use when you're trying to get your air back from doing an exercise or a run.
So let's say we come on the scene and we'll say a 4-year-old, and they got their hands on their knees, they're sitting in a chair, they're bent over. What position do we call that?
Tripod.
The tripoding, absolutely. So if they're tripoding, that's a good indicator that, hey, they're having difficulty breathing. Something else that you'll see, especially during the summertime, I guess it's because of the whole asthma, and it's just hard to breathe because it's just so god-awful hot. You'll see the retractions in the ribs. So if you have a little kid and you get a chance to just lift their shirt up for just a second, and you see you can actually see the rib cage come into full definition, and then it kind of dissipates as they breathe out. That's the retractions. We don't want to see any of that. Their little body's working hard to breathe. And the bad thing is that, their bodies, they do what's called that, what is that thing called? I can't even think.
I'm thinking of the word compensate.
That's what I was thinking of, constipation. I really was. Compensate, yes. The kids, they can compensate, and when they do it, they burn up so much energy in their system. And that's why, kids can have a major injury, and they're fine. They're talking to you. They don't know that they're missing a hand or whatnot. But at some point in time, their body and their cells run out of energy. And when it runs out of energy, they tank. And that is a very hard call to do. So to wrap that part up, just know that if we see a patient using their accessory muscles to breathe, that's not necessarily a good thing, no matter what age it is, but especially for pediatric patients, we got to get ourselves in gear. Anything you want to add on that one? Thank you for that. I really was thinking of constipation. I have no idea why. All right, so let's talk about what our parts of our airway, what does it do? What's its function? So the upper airway, and this is where we're going to talk about boogers. Okay? This is awesome. So the main function of the upper airway is to warm, filter, and humidify. But we say that all the time, but what does that? I mean, what part does what? So you know me, I'm a geek. I said, you know what? I got to look this up. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's look it up. So what I found out was is that there are some bones in our nasal passageway called the nasal conchae. They're just basically spirally little looking things in there. And when we breathe in, it actually gives the air that we breathe in more time to swirl around so it gets warmer. And it also is humidified by the membranes that's in there. I thought that was pretty cool. I didn't know that. Okay, she's sitting there shaking her head like, "Well, this
Only
I knew
because
this."
I recently just learned it. I'm in anatomy and physiology, so I really recently just read about all that the nose does. Just fun fact: um, breathing through your nose is cleaner than breathing through your mouth, because when you breathe through your mouth, that air doesn't get warm. It doesn't filter as well as the nose, because, like he said, the nose has those particular components that filter the air. So that's why when you're feeling really sick, or when you go to sleep and you're breathing through your mouth and you wake up and your throat is all jacked up and has stuff in it and it's junky,
Sound
is
like you had a
because
little something.
that air is not as clean as it would be if you were breathing through your nose.
Now let's talk about that filter system. I'm glad you did a good segue in there. You're kind of good at this, okay? That filtering system is called cilia. It's little tiny hairs that likes to clean out the particles and all the bad stuff out of the air. Now, I used to think that your nose hairs was your filter. I really did, because some of us have a lot of nose hair. Okay, but no, because we can shave those out, we can pluck them or whatnot. So further down in there, there's little tiny hairs that likes to pick those things up. Now, this is where boogers come into effect. I did not know, but the stuff that gets trapped in the cilia, eventually our body covers it with mucus and moves it further up the chain so that we can blow our nose and get it out. So, boogers are, okay, they're disgusting when you see the little kid eating them, but they are medically necessary. I did not know that. I thought that was pretty cool. So, yes, that is what our upper airway does. Anything you want to add to that? Oh, no? Okay. All right. Let's move on. So, when we're talking about the upper airway, it's going to be divided into basically two sections. We got the nasopharynx, and then we got the oropharynx. Now, this is kind of easy, but I just want to make sure everybody knows. Naso means the nose, yes. And then the oro means the mouth. The naso and the oropharynx, they both connect in the back, and then that's where the air goes. That's why you can sit there and put a NPA in a patient and establish an airway, just like you could put an OPA in a patient and still establish the airway. It's I-85 and I-40 when they join together somewhere down the line. So that's basically what that one is. All right. Let's see. What did I do? Okay. Oh, this thing has faded. It fades in. Okay. I did not know that. Y'all changed stuff. All right. So when we're still in the upper airway, we're looking at some of the bony structures of it. And it's not really bone. There's cartilage and things like that. But nothing really new on this one. But I do want you guys to know, and I know I've said it at least on some of the time, what are you feeling for? She's trying to find her cricoid process.
You all, whenever I read something about the body, I always want to,
she has
just
to
like
find
when
landmarks.
someone says, "Hey, find a pulse on yourself." I'm one of those people.
Very cool. I want you guys to know that Guilford County EMS, as far as I've been told, they have finally green-lighted the process of criking a patient out in the field. I want to say it was Engine 19 that told me that they were actually a part of the process and they got to see it. But I do know that Guilford County EMS, as far as I was told by those folk that work over there, they can now crike a patient in the field. So if you look on the picture, you'll see that the big prominence right there is going to be your cricoid process, or it's going to be your Adam's apple. Okay, so if you take your fingers and you go from your Adam's apple and just go down just a little bit, you're going to feel a very subtle divot in your throat where there's no real muscle there, but there's also no cartilage there. That's where they're going to sit there and make that quick incision. They're going to cut through the cricothyroid membrane, and they're going to put a little PVC pipe in the patient's throat, and that's where the patient's going to take that full breath. So what does that mean for us? Nothing, because we can't do it. They're not going to let us do that. I wish they would. But at the end of the day, it is a very cool procedure to see done out in the field. So I know sometimes we get on scenes and we're raring to go. We want to go to the next call or go back to the couch, whatever it is. But sometimes, guys, just slow down for a minute and really take a look at what EMS is doing, because some of their processes are absolutely amazing. They're very cool. And you never know what you're going to see. You might see somebody get cracked in the field and figure out, hey, you know what? I really want to go get my medic or something like that. Who knows? Anything you want to add? I saw you trying to find you. Did you find your membrane?
I did.
You did. All right. All right. So let's look at some more. We're going to talk about some meat and potatoes when it comes to the upper airway. We have our tongue. We have the bony structures, all that type of stuff like that. Nothing really new there. What I did find, and I thought this was pretty interesting, when it came to adults, not kids, but to adults, the most common airway obstruction is the tongue. I did not know that. I did talk about a few cycles ago the newest body modification craze, which is you're going to cut the little frenulum thing that keeps your tongue from rolling in the back of your throat. So they get the Gene Simmons tongue, the long kiss tongue. So that's one of the newest crazes out there, and I really think we're going to start to see these as time goes on with patient assessment. So just keep that in mind.
Oh, wow.
I wish you could see her face.
Yeah, thank God I don't got that struggle.
So we come up on scene and we hear snoring, respirations, no physical trauma, nothing like that. What's a good tool in our toolbox to use that will help us with that? If we're just trying to move that tongue forward.
So we have the OPA.
The OPA.
Oropharyngeal. That's the only time you're going to hear me say that word.
You jumped out there. You jumped out. I was like, man, don't mess that one up. Oropharyngeal. And what's the last part? What's the A stand for?
Airway.
Airway. Yes, I think that is. I was about to say adjunct. I jumped out there. You see what happens when you jump out sometimes? There you go. All right, so moving on. Okay, so this one right here, we're going to start talking about the lower airway. And the lower airway, like I said earlier, this is where all the magic happens. And this is the part, to be honest with you, we always glaze over this when it comes to Con Ed and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, it's not glamorous. It's not the same as putting a traction splint on or learning how to do any of that cool stuff. It's, it's the internals. We don't really pay attention to it that much because we don't see injuries like that. But we got to make sure that we understand how vital this area is during our assessment, especially during traumas, to make sure that we're not speeding through. One thing that we need to make sure that we understand is, why is it so important that we get good breath sounds and good full respirations or proper bagging into those lungs? Like what's happening with that air that goes into those lungs? What do we want to happen?
What are you asking?
So I'm asking, I say that the magic happens in the lungs, right? And we talked about it a little bit earlier. Once the air gets into the lungs, can it get out of the lungs, or what happens in there?
So I think I'm understanding what you're saying. Basically, you want good ventilation because you want that interaction with the lungs and the heart and the rest of the body to work together.
And how do we get that interaction? Where is that one location in the lungs where the oxygen and the CO2 can interact?
The alveoli.
The alveoli. Yes. This is why it's so important that we take our time and do proper ventilations and also do proper assessments when it comes to breath sounds and things like that. And we're going to see in just a minute. But just because you have a patient whose chest is rising and falling, it does not mean that air is getting all the way down there into the bottom of the lungs where we need it to. So good. All right. Still on the anatomy of the lower airway, we have the trachea. That's going to be the front part, not the back part of the throat, because we have two pipelines that runs in our throat. So if we were to be looking at the anatomical position of the patient, the trachea is going to be the one closest to the surface of the skin, not the one going to the back. Let's see here. And then we have all this good stuff right here that's going through. Just to point out, a good test question that I have seen on just about every official test that I've ever administered or taken is the carina or carina. How do you pronounce that? Is that carina or carina?
I think you said it right the first time.
Do you say pecans or pecans?
It's depending on the day. I find myself using both, depending on the day.
Is it soda or is it pop for you?
Those are two totally different words. It's soda. I mean, that's pop is like pop goes to weasel. All right,
there you go. So the carina or carina, however you want to say it, that's just the separation point that divides where you can pick going from your left bronchial or to your right. So that's always a good test question. It's the middle point, that junction point right there in the bottom of the lungs. Or I'm sorry, yeah. Okay. Um, you guys can see this, so I don't really need to read all that. Just know that our bronchioles, they're going to be smooth muscle. Okay. When we're talking about striated muscles and things like that, we're talking about things that can move and pick up heavy loads and things like that. So that's not our bronchioles. They're designed to open and close. That's pretty much it. Okay. Let's talk about this one right here. So the anatomy of the lower airway. Now, this is one that I actually like because this is a really cool science experiment that every kid, I believe, at least in elementary, has done. And it is illustrated in this picture right here. If you look at the bottom right, you'll see that the demonstration of what our diaphragm does. So in school, they would give you the little T valve. You put the two balloons in there. They would cut like a 3 liter soda bottle in half. And then they would put a balloon on the bottom. And they would go ahead and pull that balloon down. And when that balloon is pulled down, that's when the internal balloons inflate, and that's what our lungs do. But when we look at it from just that surface point of view on it, we kind of overlook some of the really cool factors about this. So I wanted to talk about this just for a minute. So when we are pulling, when our diaphragm contracts, it pulls down. It is creating a negative vacuum. It's creating a vacuum inside of our body, and that's what's causing the lungs to inflate. And to me, I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, if you've ever had the wind knocked out of you, you know that you have to have your diaphragm move in order for you to breathe, because if not, you sit there on the ground and you're gasping for air. So I thought that was pretty neat. Anything you want to add on that one?
So the diaphragm relation and the lungs relation was one of the hardest concepts for me to grasp. So the easiest way for me to think about it is when the diaphragm contracts, the lungs have space to expand. When the diaphragm expands, it pushes those lungs back. They kind of curl back up into their little wrinkled space. So that is, it's not very scientific, but that's how I visualize what the diaphragm and the lungs do. Because for the longest, I couldn't grasp the relationship between the two.
I love the way that you was doing it. Oh, it looked like you were
I really
jazzercising.
wish I was in front of a class. I want them to see what I'm doing.
You guys, yes, you should see what she's doing on her demonstrations. Maybe we can get a video of that because that was very cool. All right. So let's talk about some of the other stuff. So now we're going to talk about the mediastinum, and basically that's just the space between the lungs, and it contains everything that's important. All right. If any of these things get severely damaged in the mediastinum, you're pretty much gone. Okay. One thing that I thought that was really interesting, because everybody knows all these things. We know what a heart is. We know what the esophagus, trachea. We may not know where they are, in relation to one another, but we know what they are. And then we know what our bronchia and the nerves. But one thing I wanted to look up and just get a little bit more clarification were the great vessels. I was like, man, what's a great vessel? So I looked it up, and the great vessel is just a fancy term for our vena cava. So we know that the vena cava is a major highway when it comes to transporting deoxygenated blood back into the heart. So we have our superior vena cava, which takes everything from the shoulders on up back to the heart. And then we have our inferior vena cava, which takes everything else from below the shoulders down to the feet back to the heart. So they call that a great vessel. Now, the other great vessel is going to be the aorta. And the aorta takes all our oxygenated blood and pushes it throughout the rest of the body. So I got to digging, and I said, well, why do we call it a great vessel? I was looking for some really, prolific definition, why we do that. Yeah, no, it just said because it transports a lot of blood. I was kind of disappointed in that one. So that's what the great vessels are. All right, moving on. So we've already talked about this right here a little bit, but I want to make sure that everybody understands how what breathing is and how everything's connected. And this time I'm going to do it in a super simplistic manner. And this is the analogy that I like to use when I'm teaching my other students, because I just want everybody to be able to walk away and say that they finally got the light bulb moment if they didn't have it. So if we look at it this way, our O2 and CO2 molecules, we're going to call them passengers, okay? The red blood cells, they're going to be the buses. They're our GTA buses. The alveoli, they're the bus terminal. And now our muscles and cells, those are the bus stops. So basically what happens is red blood cells, they're going to travel to the various bus stops to pick up all our passengers, all the CO2. Then they're going to take them to the alveoli, which is the bus terminal where the CO2 passengers get off, and then the O2 passengers get on, and then the buses take the passengers to their stops, which is going to be the muscles, the cells, things like that. For me, that's the only way that works because it's so complicated. And and I hate to admit this, but the example that I think of every time when I think about this, and you're young enough to know this, the episode of SpongeBob when he's in the deep deep and he's trying to get on the bus. You see, you're laughing, so you remember this, and he can't get on the bus because it won't stop. So I just keep thinking of SpongeBob when I think of this analogy because that helps me to remember it. So whatever works, as long as you get it, that's all that matters.
That was good. That was good.
Anything you want to add to that?
And we're definitely, this is not something that we're going to have to know when we're giving oxygen to somebody on a call, but it is interesting to know that what happens in the alveoli is exactly what he said. The O2 and the carbon dioxide have that interaction with your red blood cells, and it does its thing from there on.
You almost said monoxide, didn't you? It's all good. But yes, all right. So we're going to talk about these next three parts right here just lightly. You can see what the definition of them is up here, so we don't have to stay on that for too long there. So ventilation, the main thing I want you guys to remember when it comes to ventilation is that it's a two-part system. We have the inhalation and we have the exhalation. Now, inhalation is an active process. And when we say active process, we mean that it can't happen by itself. Muscles have to contract, things have to move in order for the inhalation to occur. Because when we inhale, we talked about it just a minute ago, we know that our diaphragm goes down. That could be a test question. The diaphragm contracts or goes down. It creates a negative pressure vacuum in our system, which causes our lungs to expand, and when they expand, they end up pulling in air from the outside. That is a lot to say, but yes, just know that inhalation is an active process, and we'll talk about different pressures and stuff in just a little bit. All right, now when we get here, these are words that are always thrown around in every textbook, but I have yet to see anybody spend any real time on them, just because at the end of the day, it's not going to change how we bag anybody. This is just more for edification. Just make sure that we know our craft. So can't nobody say that, firemen are dumb. And I had no idea how many high education, high skill people we had in this department.
Oh, very much so.
I had no idea. I didn't think that firemen were dumb or nothing, but I was like, wow, we have doctors, we have skilled trade, we have electricians, we have a lot of amazing people in here. So, just to know the extra parts of our craft that, I think we should take pride in it, because that just helps to dispel that whole bad thought anyway. But nonetheless, let's get back into it. So tidal volume. In the simplest terms, the tidal volume is going to be the amount of air that moves in or out our lungs with each respiratory cycle. So when we inhale and exhale, that's going to be our tidal volume. Okay. Now, in the dead space in simplest terms is going to be the volume of air that's inhaled, but it is not used for the gas exchange. So basically, we're talking about the water that's left in the lines when nothing's really happening. It didn't make it all the way down to the alveoli, but it's still in the plumbing. So that's just the dead space right there. Anything you want to add on that?
Nope.
You have a lot of notes.
This is from class.
That's from class. Are you a left-hander?
No.
You have very good handwriting. I mean, I'm saying. It just looks like a
you.
left-handed person. All right. Exhalation. So this is the second part of ventilation. And remember, ventilation is the mechanical process of moving air in and out of our lungs. We still haven't gotten to the gas exchange or anything like that. We're just getting air in and out. So exhalation is a passive process. You don't have to do anything to let the air escape your body. You take in the nice deep breath. You don't have to tell yourself to force the air out. All you have to do is just relax. And as soon as you relax, it just flies out of there. All right. Okay, now moving on with there. Uh, what makes us want to breathe? Okay, there's lots of different chemicals and things that happens. There's lots of changes that happens in your body that your brain is constantly monitoring, and it's what tells us to breathe. Now, sometimes a lot of people will think that on a normal, average human being that's not sick, that the amount of oxygen in our system is what triggers us to breathe. But it's not that. It's flip flop. It's actually the amount of waste, the amount of CO2 that's in our system that causes us to breathe. Now, when we're talking about people who have had long term illness like COPD, their hypoxic drive has been flip flop. That's not into this discussion, but just know that there are some people who are exceptions to the rules. But for everybody else, it is the amount of waste that's built up in your system that triggers you to breathe. Now, what does that, what senses that is going to be special receptors called chemoreceptors in our brain. All right. So when we're looking at that, what is the chemoreceptor actually testing for? It's actually looking for pH changes. Okay. Now, when we say pH changes, we're just throwing it out there, just pH changes. That doesn't really mean anything. At least it didn't mean anything to me. So I had to do a little digging a while ago when I first learned this concept. And what we're looking at is we're looking at a butterfly effect. Okay. So if we don't breathe enough, we're not getting enough of what out of our system?
Okay, we're not getting rid of enough CO2.
Enough CO2. Yes, she had to take her mask off for a second. We're not getting enough CO2 out of our system. And if we allow too much CO2 to build up in our system, then our system becomes acidic. Now, of course, it's not like a 1 on the pH scale, but it falls out of homeostasis. And now it's an acidic environment, and cells do not like to live in acidic environments. They can't survive. So when our pH falls below a certain threshold, and I'm sure everybody is different, that's when our brain triggers us, hey, we need to start breathing. So the more quickly or the more rapid, how am I supposed to say it? The more rapidly? The quicker, faster? There we go. You sure?
I'm gonna say yes.
Okay. We're gonna say yes. Okay. So the quicker you breathe, the faster you're able to get the CO2 out of your system, which is going to take the acidity out, and then it's going to bring you back to a homeostatic pH. So though, if you understand that concept there, you've understood 98% of ventilation, because that's why we want to ventilate. That's why we want to ventilate at the right time when we're bagging patients and stuff, because we don't want their system to become acidic. If you think about it, the last time you did a CPR, one of the things that I'm pretty sure you saw those paramedics put into that person's system was sodium bicarb. And the sodium bicarb is there to help to counteract the acidity that builds up, because we're not perfect when we come to bagging. So sometimes we miss it, or the tube has been displaced. But while all that's happening, they're still getting CO2 being built up in their system. So they put the sodium bicarb in there to help with that. So if you understand that concept, you're well on your way. Anything you want to add to that one?
No.
You just gonna throw me out there, just gonna leave me out there by myself. Fine. All right. Oxygenation. Nothing that I really need to elaborate on this one right here. I just want to just make sure that you guys understand that just because the chest is rising and falling, or the belly when it comes to infants or tater tots, that does not mean that we're getting the respiration or the oxygenation happening in the system, because they're just mechanically pulling air in. But things like diseases, major injuries, all those things like that, they can affect how the hemoglobin is able to attach to the oxygen cells. I mean, oxygen molecules, things like that. Um, one good point would be coming out of a fire. The CO that builds up in that fire, if that patient breathes it in, CO has a much higher affinity or likeness or attraction, whatever you want to call it, to hemoglobin than oxygen does. So basically, the CO takes up all the seats on the bus, and now oxygen can't get on it. And if oxygen can't get on it, what else can't get on it? CO2. Mm-hmm. So all those things are building up. So just keep that in mind. Respiration. Respiration is the actual chemical molecular exchange through the alveoli. So we're getting the O2 and the CO2 they meet at the bus terminal. They get off the bus, they get on the bus, and all this happens in the whole web of arteries and veins that you see on the picture right here. That's the only place it can happen. Now, when we look at that makes you understand, or at least appreciate a little bit better, why asthmatic patients suffer so bad. Because when it comes to the asthmatic patients, sometimes the alveoli are collapsed down a little bit, and they actually pull away from that netting. And if they pull away from the netting, it doesn't matter how much O2 we push into their system, the exchange can't happen because they're not there. So just keep that in mind, and that will help you out greatly with that one. Yeah, that wasn't quiet at all. All right. So she left me. I'm so alone. It's all good. She'll be right back. When we're looking at this is basically just telling you everything that I just showed you. It's just giving you a more in-depth, detailed look when it comes to that, so we can move on from there. All right, now, this is, I want you guys to take this with a grain of salt, because when we look at these time frames, this is based off of the average human being. Okay, the average human being, they're not exceptionally in shape, but they're not exceptionally out of shape too. This is just average. When we look at this, we're seeing the time frames, 0 to 1 minute. We can hold our breath on our own for about a minute, some even longer than that. Nothing is really going to happen to you. You're going to have cardiac irritability, and all that means is that your heart is going to it's going to start pumping a little faster because it wants to go ahead and get the blood going. Hold on 1 second here. Okay, we're back. Sorry, had a little technical difficulty. If you go from 0 to 4 minutes, that's when you're still going to have the cardiac irritability, but we're not really expecting to see any prolonged brain damage or anything like that. No big deal. Now, when we get into the 4 to 6 minutes, the textbook is telling you that brain damage is possible. Now, there's a possibility for anything, but again, I want you to take that with a grain of salt, because I'm about to tell you about two people and talk to you about something that you'll see they challenge that every single day. Then you go to 6 to 10 minutes, and then you have brain damage is likely. Now, they say more than 10 minutes will give you irreversible brain damage. If we look at the Guinness Book of World Records, there is a sport, and it's a big sport, actually. I didn't know how big it was, so I actually looked it up. But it is a sport called free diving. And free diving is when you challenge yourself to hold your breath as long as possible while diving as deep as possible underwater, and you just want to see how deep you can go. Now, there are lots of people out there that do this sport, and there are lots of people out here who actually die from this sport because they don't take the time to train their body and things like that. But I want you to pay attention to this. The Guinness Book of World Records has currently 2 people who have the world record, and this is from 2012. One person is in contention because they say that he hyperventilated, but that's neither here nor there. Tom Sietas, Sietas, Tom Sietas has the world record for 22 minutes and 22 seconds for holding his breath underwater. There's another man named Dane Stig Severinsen, Stigseverin. He has the record for 22 minutes. These people here, they hold their breath forever and a day, and then they come up and they're fine. So there's lots of examples that you can look on YouTube. You can look up in record books and things like that. I remember seeing a young lady. She swam, I want to say it was 6 or 7 links underwater on an Olympic-sized pool. She had one of those dolphin fins, and she just kept going back and forth, and no injuries or nothing like that. So the long and short of it is, yes, this is good information to know, but just know that there are amazing people out there in the world who, they buck the system all the time. Anything you want to add on that one?
Oh, no, but definitely fascinated.
See, there we go. We learned something. All right. We talked about this one right here just a few slides ago, and so we don't really need to go back over that. Just know that everything is interconnected. Absolutely everything is. All right, and we talked about this relationship just a little bit ago. So just remember that when it comes to anything dealing with air and blood in our system, they are irrevocably connected. You can't take these two systems away from each other because without them, they just don't work. It doesn't work that way. All right, let's keep going on. We're making good time.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this stuff right here, we talked about this, or we have alluded to it, so we can keep going on from there. Just know that our all our stuff is connected. Again, I'm trying to look at the pulse ratio, perfusion ratio, mixture. Okay, yeah. Chelsea talked about that. That everything had to work together. Everything had to be in sync with one another. We talked about this just a little bit ago when I was saying how infections or severe trauma could mess around and impede the whole perfusion and the cellular exchange when it comes to breathing. So we don't have to really belabor that one. Now here's a real simple one, and you don't even have to go deep on this one right here. If we're talking about a severe allergic reaction, anaphylaxis, how can that stop you from perfusing or getting oxygen in your lungs? What happens?
Closing up things.
Closing up things, yes. So we get that massive swelling, and now air physically cannot go in. So if we're talking about the physical component of moving air in and out of our lungs, which part of that is of the whole respirations are we talking about? Are we talking about oxygenation, respiration, or ventilation?
Ventilation.
Ventilation. There we go. Because remember, guys, ventilation is the physical act of moving air in and out of the body. All right. So now we've talked about all the, the head scratching stuff. Now let's bring it just a little bit higher, close to the surface, and let's talk about trauma, because trauma is it's pretty easy to understand. If you're bleeding too much, you're gonna die. So put the wet stuff on the red stuff. So let's break these down. I just spit all over that. That's COVID right there. Oh, geez. Let's talk about these. So the external factors, and we're talking about things that will affect your respiration. The external factors, you have atmospheric pressure, and then you have the partial pressure of oxygen. That made me scratch my head because I was like, my God. I had to look that one up just to get my brain wrapped around it, and it took me a minute or two. But once the light bulb went off, I was like, you know what? I got it. So let's talk about atmospheric pressure. We know that now we don't have the NBA right now. Really, they're not playing ball. But when they were, there were some teams that had an advantage over the other teams just because of their location of their main training facility. People who train at higher altitudes, their body has become acclimated to functioning off of lesser amounts of oxygen. So when they come down to the low levels like us, they're freaking superhuman. And you can look it up. They have done lots of tests all throughout the years about the effects of high altitude training on athletes. Now, the effects aren't long lived. They'll live for about a week or so like that. But for that week, I mean, they're superhuman. They have oxygen for days. They don't get cramps and all this type of stuff. But why is that? Why is it that somebody who is at low altitude, why do they have trouble breathing at a higher altitude versus the person that's high altitude going to the low altitude? So we're going to simplify that real quick. So when we're looking at the atmospheric pressure, what we're talking about is the pressure that's around you as you try to breathe in and out. So the lower the pressure is, the harder it is for you to breathe, because air always moves from higher concentrations to lower concentrations. It's just like heat. Heat travels from higher concentrations to lower concentrations. It's just the way of the world. For your lungs to inflate, the air pressure in your lungs has to be less than the air outside of your lungs. So when you're in higher altitudes, the pressure that's in your lungs when you're a lowland person, it's always going to be a little higher because your system is acclimated to grabbing onto everything as soon as it breathes in. But when you get up there in the high altitudes, there's not much to grab on. So your body has to learn how to make do with a little bit. Mama used to make turnip salad and stuff like that. I hated that stuff. Have you ever had that?
Nope.
It is disgusting.
Sounds
my God.
bad.
Mama said you got to make do with what you got. So I said, good gosh. But nonetheless, thank Lord we ain't in them days no more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the explanation of that. So why is it that the people from the high altitude, why do they do so much better at low land activities? And again, it's because their body is acclimated to working with less. So if they can go grocery shopping for the whole week for 5 people with a $50 budget, when they go over here to Sam's Club and they, everything is dirt cheap or they get a lot of it, they do a lot better. So, and I use that analogy because that's just how my brain works. I apologize for that. Okay, next, let's talk about the partial pressure. So, partial pressure is basically a reflection of how well oxygen is able to move from your lungs to the blood. Because again, we remember that in order for the oxygen to leave your lungs, it has to cross that membrane, it has to cross that capillary membrane from the alveoli, and then it attaches to the hemoglobin. So the partial pressure is a measurement of how easy that can happen, and there's lots of things that can cause issues or resistance with that, and one of them being severe illness. So maybe like COPD or something like that. All right, pneumonia. All right, pneumonia, pulmonary edema. Those two things, they really try to go hand in hand when it comes to that. But basically, if we get fluid in our lungs, if those alveoli get submerged or covered up, you can't do the exchange. The only people that can do that are going to be fish. They have gills for that. We can't exchange oxygen through a water medium. All right, moving right along. And I think you'll be coming up here. Yeah, you'll be coming up here in just a minute.
All right.
All right. So let's talk about the trauma, and we can simplify this one really, really easily. Anything with an embolism is just a clot. Okay, you got embolism, you got thrombosis. One is stationary, one has moved, but that's not the point of this one. We're talking about the pulmonary embolism. So a pulmonary embolism affects respiration because the blockage or the clot travels to the pulmonary artery or vein in our heart, and it blocks the blood from either going into the lungs to be oxygenated or coming out of the lungs to be dispersed throughout the rest of the body. So if that clot gets lodged in either one of those super important vessels in our heart, you're pretty much screwed on that one. Next, the anything ending with that thorax. So open pneumothorax, hemopneumothorax. At the end of the day, those are lots of ways to pop the lung or to compress the lung when it shouldn't be doing that. Either you're popping the lung and you're putting air in the pleura, or you're having some type of injury and you're getting blood in the pleura. Either way, the lungs can inflate, and this prevents the lungs from inflating, which is also going to prevent oxygenation, because if the lung can't inflate, we can't do the mechanical process of ventilation.
And just to simplify, the pleura is basically that extra space around your lungs. If anything gets in it and stops your lungs from doing the full expansion that they need to do, that's going to cause issues.
Absolutely. Okay. Here's the last one. This one right here is going to culminate. It's going to bring everything together. Okay. When we're talking about circulatory issues, if you have hypovolemic shock, that means blood is pouring out of you. You don't have a lot of volume in you. If you have anemia, we're talking about you don't have a lot of red blood cells in your system. Cardiogenic shock, you have a heart attack, now your heart can't pump the blood. Or we have distributive shock, or AKA allergic reaction, severe allergic reaction. The vessels dilate way too big, and now the blood can't circulate. How does all that affect our respiration? Simple. If you don't have blood cycling through your body, or if you don't have blood in your body, then the oxygen can't get on the bus. If the oxygen can't get on the bus, the CO2 can't get on the bus, we can't get people to the bus stops where they need to go. So I hope that I made this thing as simple as possible, and I hope that the light bulb moment went off in your head when it came to this. All right, I'm going to turn it over to the legacy right here, Miss McCoy.
No. Thank you, Jonathan. All right. So now we're getting into us. How does this relate to us and what we do? Starting with patient assessment, the biggest thing that we have to perfect as professionals, as EMT professionals, is recognizing regular breathing and also recognizing abnormal breathing. Normal breathing is going to be numbers-wise. You're going to make sure the person is breathing 12 to 20 breaths per minute. Make sure it's regular. Make sure that it is equal. Make sure that you're seeing good chest rise and fall when looking at the patient. So what is abnormal breathing? Again, numbers. Fewer than 12 breaths per minute or more than 20 breaths per minute is abnormal. You see unequal chest rise, or you hear something extra in the lungs when you're listening to lung sounds. So when listening to lung sounds or when assessing someone's breathing, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. You can use a stethoscope to listen to lung sounds, but also to count someone's breathing. Simply looking at them for chest rise and fall, or you can do palpation. Just make sure when you're doing palpation that you stay professional with the patient. How you're going to check for those things, you're going to remember that a rise and a fall is 1 breath, and check for 30 seconds. Whatever number you get, multiply by 2. All right? Make sure we don't miss anything. So some more things that you want to look for when talking about abnormal breathing is also how the patient looks. If they are blue or cyanotic, pale, cool, moist, obviously something is wrong.
I thought you were trying to judge them for a minute. You say how they look.
No, not you guys. I don't judge. So how they look, and also like we talked about earlier, using those accessory muscles when they're breathing. So those are kind of things you want to look for. All right. So if a person doesn't have a pulse, but you see them gasping for air, you see them, it sounds like they're snoring, those are going to be called agonal breaths. I want you all to always remember, if a person has no pulse, you have to do CPR. So don't get confused when you're doing an assessment. You're looking at a patient, well, they're breathing. If a victim does not have a pulse, you need to begin CPR. All right, so this Shane Stokes respirations, and I'm getting excited because I thought this was really cool when I looked it up. So basically, Shane Stokes respirations kind of sounds like a dog panting. So it's going to sound something like this. So that increase in panting really fast. So basically, we talked about earlier, your body goes off of the CO2 levels when it comes to breathing. So that increase, your body's like, I need more CO, I need more. And then when it drops, your body's like, oh, or make sure I'm saying this right. I think I'm saying it backwards. I'm sorry. Flip that. Okay. When you're breathing it out, when the panting is happening, your body is trying to get rid of it quickly. When there's nothing happening, your body's like, well, I got enough CO, so stop breathing it out. Sorry, y'all, didn't mean to confuse you. So that's Shane Stokes. So remember, a dog panting. You'll hear that. Ataxic respirations. So ataxic, think of, they're going to sound like your body has no earthly idea what it's doing when it comes to breathing. When you're listening to the person's lung sounds, you're going to feel yourself saying, oh my goodness, I can't figure out how this person's breathing, because they're probably doing ataxic respirations. This can occur with trauma to the head or a head injury. Basically, like I said before, your brain is just confused on how to breathe. Kuzmal, not Kusmal, but Kuzmal respirations. Those are going to be your deep, rapid respirations. So we talked about sort of something like this earlier. When you go for that good run and you're done and you're doing that deep breathing to get all that air back, that's going to be what Kuzmal is going to sound like. But this person hasn't been running. They're just breathing like this. So what about all these different type of respirations are we looking for? They're abnormal, and we're going to treat them by either doing assisting with ventilation or just taking over ventilation altogether. Right? And like we said before, if a good indicator of if a person's receiving enough oxygen is how they look, in terms of if they're cyanotic, blue, especially around the lips, and that sort of thing you can look for. All right, so The pulse ox, I look at the pulse ox as like the golden child of the med bag. If we don't do nothing else on a scene, we're going to pull out that pulse ox and we're going to put it on that patient's finger. Remember, it is just a tool. When you're using that pulse ox, also look at your patient. You all know, we've seen it on 100 memes, look at me. Look at me. So always look at your patient. If your pulse ox says 94 and your patient is blue and they're using all their accessory muscles, you need to take action. But it says 94. Forget your tool. It ain't working. Always assess your patient along with using the tools that we have in the med bag. All right, opening the airway. Opening the airway, we're going to talk about a couple of different ways that you can do that here in a couple of slides. But you want to do this when the patient is supine, laying on their spine. That's the best way that you're going to open the airway. And opening the airway can actually sometimes fix a lot of what's going on. We talked about earlier that the tongue for adults is what blocks the airway. If you open that airway, you take care of that tongue problem. All right. We just did that. You see how that tongue is just blocking the airway? All right, let's move on. So other things that could obstruct the airway, you have dentures, blood, vomit, mucus, disgusting, food, and other foreign objects, especially in babies. They seem to pick up any and everything. I want to make sure I tell you everything I wanted to tell you. We'll see it later on. Something that we have in our med bag that we kind of treat like the third cousin who was invited to the cookout. We'll talk about that later, what we can use to take care of these type of airway obstructions. I think you all know what that is. All right, your head tilt chin lift. It is exactly what it says. I feel like they created that name for firefighters. You do head tilt and you lift the chin up. This takes away that tongue obstruction. You want to use this for patients who you do not suspect or who've not sustained a spine injury or severe trauma.
So what would be some signs and symptoms that would lead us to believe they might have spine injury or head trauma?
So definitely depending on your call. If you ran a call on a person who fell off the roof, do you think he probably has a spine injury? You don't want to do the head tilt chin lift if needed to and doing CPR opening the airway. Also, if you see a lot of disfigurement in the face or you're not able to do the head tilt chin lift, that could also be a hint that they probably have a spinal injury. So what do we do for people who have spine injuries? You're going to do the jaw thrust maneuver. So basically you're thrusting that jaw up, and this is for people who you suspect have a spinal cord injury or severe trauma. We sort of went over this before, but one thing when you're doing the jaw thrust maneuver, also any type of opening the airway maneuver, make sure that it's correct. And the only way we know it's correct is looking at chest rise and fall when we start to ventilate for this patient. So make sure always, like I said, look at your patient. And that is just, I'm not going to read each one, but you can pause this video and read through that PowerPoint right quick on how to do the jaw thrust maneuver. It's something we don't do very often, but it is something that we need to know because we can run into those situations. The suction machine. This is that third cousin who wasn't invited to the cookout. So it is a tool that we have on the fire truck that we should be checking daily and making sure that it works. It has all the equipment to it. That's what we're going to be using to take care of those other obstructions that we talked about earlier, mucus, vomit, etc. When doing suctioning, you never want to suction adults for more than 15 seconds. Children, 10, babies, 5. So 5, 10, 15, infants, children, adults. when doing your suctioning, or let me hit on that point. If you suction too long, you will I'm tripping over my words here.
Pull too much oxygen out.
Yes, you will be actually reversing the effects of trying to get air into the victim. So how you're going to suction, make sure you have all your equipment. You all, let me just pause right here and digress a little bit. Make sure you are checking your bag every single day you work, especially that equipment that we don't touch a lot, we don't always use. Because I got caught looking one day, putting that suction machine together, and guess what I'm missing? That little aggravating elbow that I swear I don't understand why it comes in an individual bag. Like, I don't understand why it don't come with everything else. So make sure you have everything, the elbow, the tube that goes into the suction machine, and then the yonker that goes into the mouth. How you're going to use it, make sure everything is together, turn that suction machine on. The yonker, you don't got to go far down into their esophagus. Just the side of their cheek, couple seconds on each side, take it out, ventilate, and repeat as need be, depending on how much mucus or substance is coming up into the victim's airway. I'm actually going to go back. If suctioning is not working, or you feel there's a lot that's going on, or it's too thick for the suction machine to pull up, you can also roll the victim over to their side, clear it out with a gloved hand, and then roll them back over.
Now, let me jump in on one thing on this one. Take it from me, from personal experience, guys. If you use the suction machine, please clean it out, okay? I know that now we have it to where we can kind of trade in the parts or whatnot, but there's also some stuff left inside the actual pump itself. So after you get finished with it, you get back to the house, please run some soapy water through that thing or something to clean out the particles that will build up in there, because I promise you, when the next time you come to shift and you check it, little things like to grow in that. So, yeah, don't do that.
Oh, wow. That's disgusting.
It is. It really was.
Gross. Like we talked about earlier, that's a cycle of using your suction machine and ventilation. Make sure you don't do no more than 5 seconds for babies, 10 seconds for children, 15 seconds for adults. A cartoon. I like cartoons.
I do too.
All right, so our basic airway adjuncts. The first one we're going to talk about is the OPA. I already said that word once today. We're not going to say it again. So basically keeps the tongue from blocking the airway, and it allows ventilation to run smoothly. When are you going to use the OPA? If the victim has no gag reflex, unresponsive, and you're using a BVM. Contraindications, when you're not going to use it. When a patient is unconscious, or when they have a gag reflex. So if you try to put that in, you keep getting the bleh, don't keep forcing it.
Do that again.
Move on. I'm not going to do it again. Move on to your next airway adjunct. And I wish you had a picture. You guys, man, I wish we were face to face. So your OPA, if you're not familiar of what that is, go ahead and go to your med bag right quick. Pause the video. Go to your med bag. It's going to be that hard plastic device that is usually with your airway bag or with your BVM section of your med bag. So go look at that right quick if you don't know what it is. All right, so your nasopharyngeal airways or NPA is going to be that the long green flimsy tube, and it's going to go into your nose. Indications or when you're going to use it. Person unresponsive. They do have a gag reflex, so that gives you another option for if someone has a gag reflex and you can't use the OPA, use the NPA, it goes to the nose. And the person's not able to obtain their own airway. Some more indications, they are, like we said before, they have that gag reflex, so you can't use the OPA. And if they have a severe head injury, or excuse me, these are your contraindications. So when we're not going to use it is it when they have a severe head injury or history of fractured nasal bone. Because obviously you don't want to be breaking up what's already been broken up. So don't do it.
So you're saying it's not a good idea to tickle somebody's brain?
No. You guys, I wasn't going to laugh. I wasn't going to laugh. I couldn't help it. And that little cartoon there. I know some people in the fire department who could do compressions right through the bed like that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Other ways of maintaining an airway. If you run into somebody, an unconscious patient, and they're not injured, they're breathing on their own, they're just unconscious. And this is something that I have to remember to do, is putting the person in the recovery position. Roll them over to their side, put their arm under their head, and monitor the patient, make sure they have nothing in their airway, and make sure they're still breathing and have a good pulse. And we just talked about those lovely steps. All right, supplementary oxygen. Yes, I think this is me. Anybody who needs oxygen, make sure you give it to them. This is also the golden child of the med bag. We are very good at very good at putting oxygen on the patient who needs it, reading that pulse ox and understanding that they're below 90% and giving them the oxygen to that patient. I like this point. Not all patients need high concentrations of oxygen. So we referenced a lot earlier our COPD patients. And this is something I have to constantly remind myself when I look over the med bag in the morning. If you run into a person and you know they have COPD, you don't have to give them if their pulse ox reads a little bit lower than normal. That's why we ask the med questions. That's why we get medical history. It's probably because they have COPD and they have that reverse effect of CO2 and oxygen and hemoglobin relationship inside of them. But in simpler cases, if a person just needs a nasal cannula, there's no reason to bump the oxygen to 15. Make sure we know the numbers associated with the different devices that we use delivering oxygen, so we're not giving them too much.
I wanted to jump in on this one just a little bit. When we're talking about these things here, please make sure that you guys are still looking at our protocols. The last bullet point here is one that got a lot of points of contention because forever and a day we taught that the minimum was 94%. But when we look at our protocols, it is actually 90%, with the goal being 94%. I know we've already done our protocol exam and whatnot, so we don't have to worry about this for another 3 years or whatnot. But just keep in mind, our protocols, sometimes they evolve faster than the textbook. So just keep in mind to look over your protocols every once in a while. I'm sorry, I didn't want to jump in.
Oh, no, you're fine. Just want to make sure I'm not going further than I'm supposed to. Kind of got caught up.
No, you're fine.
So these are amazing equipment that we have in delivering oxygen, nasal cannula, novel breather mask, and the bag mask device. Make sure you're familiar with how to use these devices. I know that we practice with them all the time, but that nasal cannula, for some reason, when you pull it out, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to put this on the patient. Make sure you're familiarizing yourself with that equipment all the time, because it's easy to forget how to place it exactly or use it exactly. When using that bag mask device, I think we'll see it later on, but I'm just going to touch on it right here. Make sure that you have a good seal when you're using the bag mask device using the EC clamp technique. Man, I wish you all were in front of me. Make sure you just have a tight seal on the face. A person without their dentures in, and they usually wear dentures, it's going to be a little bit harder, but we're strong enough to complete that seal. And when you breathe for the patient, what are we looking for? Chest rise and fall. You don't have to squeeze the bag with all your might. Just squeeze it enough to get air to see chest rise and fall. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jonathan.
I don't know how far I'm going, but let's talk about the tracheostomy mask. This is something that we don't see very often in our bags. I know at one point in time we used to have, all these things and everything was carried, but over the years we've seen things slowly start to kind of get phased out. Good example of it. When's the last time you seen a piercing nozzle on a truck? Yeah, they've been there. Things phase out. And this is just one of them that has slowly started to go away. And you'll see them on the ambulances, but sometimes you won't see them in our bags. You might have an old relic here or there. But the thing to keep in mind is that when you're dealing with a patient that has a tracheostomy hole or tube, or sometimes you even have a stoma a tube, a stoma hole in there, before you start trying to ventilate, always try to suction out that area, because a lot of times the problem that's happened is that it's just become gunked up with some snot or whatnot. Because everybody, when they get these procedures done, they're taught how to take care of them and everything, but they're human. They get lax. We all get into that kind of autopilot mode, and every once in a while you get the little loogie booger that gets in there.
Or they're in nursing homes.
Look, the nurses are trying their best.
See, you called out a particular group of people. I just said nursing homes. So I put that back on you.
So first things first, we want to go ahead and make sure that we attempt to suction that area out if at all possible. We're still going to follow the same rules as our suctioning guidelines that we showed you earlier. We're going to suction on the way out. We don't want to do it for no longer than 10, but the textbook is saying 15 seconds. Go with whatever the protocol says. We don't want to go longer than that. Excuse me. And we do not want to lose sight of the end of the suctioning tip. If we lose sight of it, 9 times out of 10, you've gone too deep. Okay, so try to be able to visualize it the best you can. If that still has not produced any positive effects, then we want to go ahead and start assisting the patient with the ventilation. So we can put a mask on it, and typically a PEDS mask will fit the best for it. But even if you don't have a PEDS mask, you can even put the mask that we use for the BVM, if nothing else, and just try to keep a nice tight seal around it. This one right here gives you quite a bit of flexibility when it comes to the sizes and the technique on it, because honestly, it's just a hole in the throat. It's not that big. So, you don't have to worry about if you don't have the exact perfect size mask or whatnot. You can make things work. Okay, we just talked about this right here, and so we can keep moving on from there. All right, so now we're back. All right, let's see here. Let's keep going. Okay, so let's talk about the art of artificial ventilation. This is something that is extremely important, but if we do it correctly, it can be very effective, but at the same time, we can do a lot of damage. We've seen over the years through clinical studies and things like that we have caused actually quite a bit of damage internally to patients just because our technique wasn't what it should have been. One of the reasons that they no longer recommend us suctioning newborns is because we were doing the suctioning incorrectly. And then while they have so many rules and things like that when it comes to ventilation, is because we were actually causing barotrauma or pressure trauma into the infants when we were sitting there hand fisting those things, the bags. So it's one of those things to where it's a great skill to have, and it's very useful to us, but it's only useful in the right hands. So we're going to talk about a little bit of that as we keep going on. Okay. We're going to talk about two different options. One is going to be our standard assisted ventilation. The other one is going to be CPAP. There are going to be times where one is going to be better than the other, and there are going to be times where one is just going to be more effective than the other, depending on the situation. Okay, so here are some signs and symptoms of the inadequate ventilation. You're going to have altered mental status. Now, why would we have altered mental status? Well, if we're trying to figure out if we're going to be ventilating the person or if we're not ventilating them correctly, that means they're not getting what to their brain?
Enough air.
They're not getting enough air, not getting enough oxygen. So if you don't get enough oxygen, you're going to be in a hypoxic state. You're going to get a little loopy. So that goes without saying. Inadequate minute volume. Basically, they're just saying how much air comes out in a minute. And then we've already talked about it, but the accessory muscle use and fatigue. somebody becomes real tired when when they're having difficulty breathing is because they're recruiting so many extra muscles to try to pull the air in, and that'll wear you out. Okay. So when we're going to decide to use a BVM, it's really important that we think about customer service. Okay. If the patient is not unconscious, they already having a bad day. If we have to sit there and put a mask on them and breathe for them, that's not a good day for that person. So we don't need to go there and just say, here, take this, we're going to do this. Yeah, we need to have a little pep in our step, but at the same time, have a little consideration for the patient. What are they feeling? So that's why we're telling you guys, explain the procedure to the patient, because they're already going to be scared. And if you're scared, you do what? You breathe faster, you start to panic. We don't need any of that. So we want to try to give them a sense of calm, let them know that we're there to help them, and try to walk them through the procedure while we're doing it so that they don't become apprehensive or scared about anything. You want to make sure that you get proper seal. Can't stress this enough, and Chelsea talked about it earlier with the EC clamp technique. If you allow a gap to form when we're putting out on the mask, then you're kind of just running in the sand. You're making your job a little bit harder than what it needs to be, and the patient's not going to get that good of a benefit. So we want to make sure that we're getting proper placement each time. The next one is a big one. We want to squeeze the bag in unison with the patient's breathing cycle. So if the patient is trying to exhale, that is not the time when you want to squeeze the bag, because somebody's not going to win. So we need to make sure that we're fully focused on what we're doing. And this is a huge problem with people who are brand new to the service, because they're trying to absorb everything that's going on, that's happening around them. When at the end of the day, if you're the airman, you need to be focused on air. You need to be focused on the ventilations, because if you start to kind of go into autopilot mode or zone out, you're going to have problems like this. And if we're fighting the patient with their breaths, that's just not going to be good. We want to make sure that we just maintain the proper breath ratio with roughly one breath every 5 to 6 seconds when we're ventilating the patient. If we have an advanced airway in, if not, then we're going to adjust our time in a little bit just to work with the patient. But we want to make sure that we're paying attention to our patient and looking for those signs of inadequate ventilation, like cyanosis, turning pale, things like that. We don't want to see any of that. Anything you want to add on that?
And always remember, the easiest way to tell if your ventilation is working: chest rise and fall.
I thought you were going to say if they die or something, but yes, chest rise and fall. Okay, let's see here. So patients in respiratory arrest need immediate treatment to live. We talked about this at the very beginning when we look at our acronym for the ABCs. 2 out of 3 of our important letters deal with air. So that just goes to reiterate how important it is for us to get air into the patient. We've talked about this one right here when it comes to the diaphragm moving. But the thing that makes artificial ventilation different from normal breathing is that we are pushing air into the lungs, not pulling air into the lungs. When the diaphragm goes down, it creates the vacuum or the negative pressure that pulls air, whereas when we're squeezing the BVM or when we connect them to the O2 cylinder, it is pushing air into it. Okay. And this right here is just talking about what the effects of the positive pressure ventilation can be. You need to just be careful that you don't push so much air in that you're causing gastric distension. And when we say gastric distension, we're talking about the belly fills up with air. All right, so let's keep on going with this now. Okay, so we've already hit on this a few times, so we don't really need to get back on it, but these are the signs of adequate ventilation. These are things you want to see. A big one that a lot of people, is kind of hard concept to understand or to grasp when you haven't done it before, but when it talks about no resistance when ventilation. So when we're talking about resistance, what do we mean? We mean that when you squeeze that bag, it feels like there is something kind of pushing back on you or on your hand as you're trying to squeeze the bag, or it's really difficult to get that bag to squeeze down. And that's that resistance that we're talking about. When you have resistance, that could mean that either there's an obstruction in there, or maybe your tube wasn't placed in the correct position, or maybe even you're not in sync with the patient's respiratory cycle, because if they're trying to breathe out while you're trying to squeeze the bag, guess what? You're going to have resistance. So that's what we're talking about when we're referring to that. So just make sure that you're careful when you're doing that, and just pay attention to the patient and what you're doing. Okay. So this one right here is just telling us that if you're having issues with the BVM, switch, do something else. The worst thing in the world that you can do is keep hitting your head against the wall if the door won't open. Find something else. That's why we have OPA, we have NPA, we have different options. So don't get so single-minded or so tunnel vision that you just get stuck with there.
Also, keep in mind when using the bag mask device and you're not seeing that chest rise and fall, don't necessarily squeeze the bag harder as if you're not giving them enough air. It more than likely is probably your seal, or you haven't done the head tilt chin lift.
Oh, yeah.
That is, during our CPR, that is a lot of what I saw. The head tilt chin lift, you have to open the airway, and I think one of these points say that. You have to open the airway in order to get air into the victim. So it's versus thinking I just got to put more air into the victim. Take the bag mask off of the mouth, reposition, do the head tilt chin lift or jaw thrust, and continue ventilating. So more than likely it's probably a positioning problem, not enough pushing on the bag problem.
All right, good point. Good point. Okay. Let's talk about gastric distension real quick. This is when the belly fills up with air, and I think I have roughly 15 or 16 CPRs under my belt since I've been here, and I've had one gastric distension, and they threw up on me. that's one
like it came up and out of their mouth and on your body.
Yeah, it came up. It wasn't fun. That was not pleasant at all. So when we're talking about gastric distension, basically what we're saying is your stomach is a balloon. And when you keep filling that balloon up and up with air, eventually one or two things is going to happen. Either it's going to pop or the muscles around it is going to squeeze. And since our stomach doesn't pop that easily, the muscles around it, once it reaches its set point, it squeezes very violently, and then everything that they have for the last 2 or 3 days comes up. So that is not fun. So be very careful with that. It typically is going to happen when we're talking about working on children, and that's because anatomically speaking, their airway and things like that, they're just different sizes. They're different sizes than an adult. They're harder to navigate and negotiate the breathing, just because of those anatomical differences in size and stuff. So it can be tricky. Thankfully, I've never had to do a CPR on a kid, but if you know of anybody who has had to do it on a kid, they are a great source of information to talk to about that, because it is different. It's I wouldn't say it's necessarily harder, but it has its own little nuances that if you're not aware of them, it can make it a lot more challenging to you. Anything you want to add on that one?
Gastric distension is, I don't know how many CPRs I've done. You probably more than likely are going to see it eventually if you're doing CPR for a long period of time, even with good ventilation. So you're going to see it. Remember that tool that we have in our bag, that suction machine. You can use it. You can use it as a firefighter EMT with Greensboro Fire Department. That's something you can use to help compensate for some of the issues that occur with gastric distension.
I think that the whole thing about us not being able to use that thought process, it actually comes from the misunderstanding that as an EMTB, we are checked off on to use hard suction catheters, but as an EMTB, we are not checked off on flexible catheters. So I think a lot of people, they just throw that flexible catheter, us not being able, allowed to use that out in the field, and saying, well, we can't use suction like that. I think that might be where some of the disconnect is.
So I just think that it's, the suction machine is not, I've only used it a couple of times on a couple of CPRs, but I think it's just a forgotten tool sometimes.
I can definitely agree with that one. All right. So Chelsea has already hit on quite a few of this right here, and you guys have seen on slides, so we can actually keep going on this. But again, the most important thing that I want to impress upon you guys is to just pay attention to what you're doing. If you're on scene and you're assigned ventilation. That's all you need to be concerned about at that moment is ventilation. Because if you're 100% in the moment with your skills and with what you need to be doing, you're doing your part. You don't need to worry about the other things. You're doing your part, and things will run a lot smoother versus if you were worried about what Tom, Dick, or Harry was doing with the IO drill, or did they give enough epinephrine? That's not even in our bag of tricks that we can do, but sometimes we get sidetracked. So just pay attention to what you're doing. All right, next one. Let's see here. Okay, all right. We had to do a quick powwow real quick, just make sure that we was all on the same page. But let's talk about this interesting concept of passive ventilation. Okay, this is a phenomenon that we see during CPRs, because basically what happens is every time I push down on the patient's chest, I am forcing air out of their lungs. So I'm actually taking place of their own ventilation process. I am mechanically pushing air out. So in essence, I'm taking place of the movement of the diaphragm. So when we push on the chest, air goes out. When we come off the chest, air goes back in because we're allowing things to spread out and open back up. Now, how does this affect us out in the field? It affects us because just like we were talking about just a minute ago when we were doing assisted ventilations with a patient, like with the BVM and stuff, we have to pay attention to this aspect of ventilation as well. Because if I'm sitting there trying to squeeze the bag while my partner is actively doing a compression, they're going to be forcing air out of the lungs. I'm going to be trying to force air into the lungs, and then we're going to get that resistance that I was talking about earlier. So again, if you're on ventilations, you need to pay very close attention to what you're doing, because the whole rhythm and flow of this CPR, it really hinges on you. If we don't get air into the patient, we can't get the CO2 out of the patient. We can't get the pH back to homeostasis. If you don't do what you're supposed to do as the ventilation person, everything else is not going to be effective. It's not going to be as effective as it could be. So I just want you guys to just pay attention to this while you're doing it. You have to work in unison with one another. All right, so let's keep going. Next one, CPAP. Man, CPAP, I remember when in 2017, when we changed, we had our transition. And some of you guys may remember this, but we went from CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, to NIPAVUV, non-invasive positive pressure ventilation. The exact same thing, just somebody who gets paid a lot more than us decided that they wanted to go ahead and change up the acronym. Don't know why, but nothing else has changed about it. As far as I know, it is still an EMT level skill. For all intents and purposes, all we're really doing is just assisting the patient with strapping it to their head, or we're going to strap it to the patient's head, but you get what I'm saying. We're just pulling a couple of straps, putting things together. Everything is good to go. Lots of people use CPAPs. They have come a long way. Some people even at the stations use CPAPs. They used to be these loud chugga type things. See, I made sound effects too. To now, I mean, I think I remember hearing about one that you can. It's like the size of a deck of cards or something that you can wear on airplanes because it's so quiet, something like that. But yeah, science has definitely progressed as time has gone on. Now, how does CPAP work? Basically, again, it's continuous positive pressure going into the airway. So we're forcing air in there. So we're going to force open some collapsed alveoli, maybe even be able to open up some bronchial passageways just a little bit, just enough to get some air in there. But also at the same time, it also helps to push fluid through the cellular membrane of the lungs and whatnot to get it out of the lungs. Because if we have fluid in the lungs, we're possibly going to get our alveoli submerged, and we can't do the gas exchange through a water medium. So the CPAP is another cousin at the cookout. I'm gonna say probably fifth cousin that definitely doesn't get invited to. They're the family member that don't bring nothing but maybe some forks, plastic forks. But everybody else got dishes, but they bring that. So
only on Christmas.
Only on Christmas too. They the first ones to get a plate and everything. So there you go. Okay, I've already talked about this. We're just going to strap it to the patient's head. That's pretty much it on that one. Here's some indications. Now, these are very important because this is a pretty aggressive piece of equipment. It looks aggressive, and its mechanism is a little aggressive. And I'm not saying aggressive in a bad way, but I'm saying to where your patient needs to kind of have their mental faculties with them to so that they're not scared when this thing cuts on or when they feel that pressure against their nose and mouth. You need to make sure that they're alert, they can follow commands. They don't have juicy mouth syndrome, and I just say that just to help me remember that's just a lot of secretions in the mouth. Because if they have a lot of bleeding in the mouth or they're throwing up and stuff, and we push that stuff right back down into the airway, that's not a good thing because you can get liquid in there, you can get food in there, so we don't want that. So we need to make sure that we're on top of that one, and all these other ones that's up there. So just take time to make sure that you're just familiar with it, and again, this will help you out if you have to use it. Now, the contraindications, I've already mentioned some of that right there, and these are going right here. Now, I think that this one is kind of funny to me because they put a patient who has a tracheostomy. Why would you need to tell me that a patient who doesn't breathe through their mouth shouldn't use a CPAP? They're breathing through their neck. So I think that's just a gag one. That's just to make sure that you're paying attention. But yes, if a patient has a tracheostomy in in their throat, we don't want to use the CPAP machine on that.
Well, it's funny you say that, is a gag, but it's also just something we have to keep in mind because sometimes it's hard to, you get on scene, you know it's a CPR, you know for sure what you're going to be doing. You grab that mask device and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't see chest rise and fall. And it could be simply because they have a trach. What do? Take the mask off, connect it to the trach, and start ventilation again. Keep that in mind on when you're in that CPR mode.
There you go. All right. So again, we've already talked about this one right here. When we're looking at this unit of measurement, 7 to 10 centimeters of water, we're talking about what we're setting that dial on when we're setting the actual CPAP machine to flow. Anywhere from 7 to 10, you always want to start on the low end and work your way up. Too high of a flow can have negative effects on the patient. So we just want to start it and we want to reevaluate. We tell everybody all the time, anytime you do any type of intervention, you need to do vitals or assessments before and after because we need to see which way they're going to be trending. Did we hurt them or did we help them? So just keep that in mind, 7 to 10. And last but not least, here are some complications that can happen when it comes to CPAP. I'm actually not 100% well versed on this stuff here, so I'm not going to pretend to even start to talk on that. Just be aware that these things are there. Of course, the first one is that the CPAP could make somebody, if they're already claustrophobic, it can kind of aggravate that just because, again, this is a very aggressive type of piece of equipment. So just be wary of that and talk to your patient. If it's not a situation where you got to go, talk to them, make sure that they're okay. When it comes to the pneumothorax, pushing air into the lungs, it can pop a lung if there was already pre-existing trauma or if the patient was already at high risk for something like a spontaneous pneumothorax. Typically, patients like that are going to be our tall, thin-framed, I think it's teenage male patients are the ones that are most susceptible. Basically, just imagine your cross-country track runners, and those are the ones who are the most susceptible to a spontaneous pneumothorax. Other than that, just be aware these things are here. We do know that when we introduce a large amount of air into the patient's system, that it can cause a massive or a systemic vasoconstriction in the brain. That's why we got to be really leery when we're talking about strokes. So maybe that can play into why the blood pressure goes down. Not 100%, but we would definitely just be aware of it. Anything you want to add on? All right. So let's turn this over to Miss Chelsea. I know y'all tired of hearing from me, so let's go ahead and hear from her.
All right, special considerations, all the little extras that can go on with talking about ventilation and respiration. So stomas and Jonathan, you're gonna help me out with this word.
Tracheostomy.
Tracheostomy tubes. Y'all, I'm not the best at pronouncing.
Really, you can say oropharyngeal and nasopharyngeal, but you can't say tracheostomy.
I don't think you understood. I broke oropharyngeal. I have to say it in 3 separate. Anyways, so that's what we're going to be talking about with the beginning of our special considerations. So what you're seeing in this picture here is something that they call a stoma. But note that a stoma is not just this special mark that on somebody. A stoma is any opening in the body. So your nose is basically a stoma. Your mouth is a stoma. So let's move on. Remember, when you see this in a patient, like we talked about before, the trach is open. So doing any type of ventilation through the mouth is not going to work because your air is going to escape. So neither the head tilt chin lift or the jaw thrust is needed or helpful. You're going to actually ventilate through that opening in the throat. If they do not have a trach sticking out of the stoma, you're just going to put you could use, like we talked about earlier, a pediatric mask or the adult mask over that stoma and breathing as normal for the patient. Foreign body airway obstructions, just a long, fancy way of saying choking. Choking can lead to death, obviously. Like we talked about before, allergies can cause swelling. Swelling closes up the airway. That doesn't allow air to go in. Choking, same thing. Usually adults choke in meal. And children and infants are really susceptible to choking because they like to put all sorts of kind of funny things into their mouths. Side note, when dealing with pediatrics, if you take care of pediatric patients, make sure you're always watching for children and what they do and what they're handling so they don't have that kind of incident. For unconscious patient, what is the most common airway obstruction? The tongue. We said this a couple of times earlier before. How do you fix that? The head tilt chin lift, opening the airway. Other things can cause obstruction. We talked about swelling from allergies or also trauma. Tissue damage in that area can cause a blockage. Recognizing early that someone is having has an airway obstruction is crucial, obviously. What you could see in a mild airway obstruction. So when we say mild, it hasn't fully obstructed their airway. They're able to get a little bit of air in and out, but it's not completely effective. You'll hear wheezing, noisy breathing. The person will probably do a lot of coughing. When that happens, or when you're dealing with a patient who is having a mild airway obstruction, don't do, how do I say this? Obviously, you're not going to stop them from doing what they're doing because their body is working on fixing that problem. So don't interrupt that process, basically. Treat immediately. Take care of the patient. If need be, put them on oxygen. And again, don't do too much to alter that body trying to correct that airway obstruction. So severe airway obstruction is completely closed. They are moving no type of air, choking. The victim will not be able to talk or say anything to you. And that is, you see in the picture, in the universal sign of choking. So what are we going to do? You're going to get behind that victim. You're going to find their belly button. Put your hand in a fist. The thumb side is going to go right above the belly button. You're going to go in and upward until the object comes out or the victim becomes unresponsive. If the victim becomes unresponsive, you're going to need to start CPR.
I want y'all to know she was demonstrating how to do the Heimlich on herself.
You all, this won't go on forever, I promise. I promise this won't go on forever. When doing CPR on a person who had an obstruction or who was choking, you're going to do your 30 compressions, your CPR. You're going to look in the mouth to see if you see something, and then you're going to deliver your 2 breaths. 30 compressions, look in the mouth, 2 breaths. 30 look 2, 30 look 2. Make sure you perform the head tilt chin lift again. We got to open that airway. If you see something, with a gloved hand. Take it out. Reassess your victim. If need be, continue CPR. Compressions can either push that, whatever it is, up out of the airway, or breathing is going to push it down out of the airway. Your goal is just to get it out of the airway so they can start receiving the proper oxidation. All right. Other things that can cause obstruction: dentures, crown, bridge, pieces of braces. Oh, that would be terrible. Can you imagine a piece of your brace in your throat? All right.
I've never had braces, but I think that would suck.
That's gotta hurt. Just like for any other airway obstruction, we're going to do the same kind of treatment. These are just other things that can cause that obstruction. If you are doing CPR on someone who has dentures, it's best to go ahead and take out those dentures. Unless it's helping with the airway or otherwise advised from EMS, go ahead and take out those dentures so they don't become a problem when you're doing so much manipulation inside the patient's mouth.
Now, going off of that right there, there has been a debate going on for the last few years about that. Some people say that as long as the dentures are still fitting well, we want to leave them in there just because it frames the face. But then you have the other faction that's saying, let's not even worry about that. Let's just go and pull it out. I agree with her, guys. If EMS asks you to pull them out, go ahead and pull them out. But if they're not loose, if they're not going to be a problem, at least while we're there, then that's just one less thing that we have to be responsible for. Just make sure you just take everything as the situation goes. It's a very dynamic situation. No one size fits all. Just be careful with it.
Just some tidbits. So facial trauma can also be a huge interruption in ventilation and good respirations for the victim. I don't see it here. I feel like I probably skipped it over. When doing ventilation for someone who has obstruction, if you see frothy or liquid in the victim's mouth, ventilation needs to happen immediately, like right now. Whatever else you need to put together, someone needs to be breathing for that patient. Injuries from a trauma can cause severe issues with the airway. Controlling breathing with direct pressure and suction as necessary. Again, we talked about suctioning earlier. It is something you can do. It can be extremely useful with clearing up an airway. Remember 5, 10, 15, babies, children, and adults. And we have made it to the end of our PowerPoint.
See, guys, you got to understand just how it take y'all a while to listen to it. It takes us a while to make this. We've had some interesting things happen, so we made it.
We made it.
I had fun with you. I did. This was a lot of fun.
It was something different. I will admit, as a lot of you who know who I am, I can't stand PowerPoints. So I'm glad that we are, from here on out, we'll be progressing towards better things when it comes to EMT and getting our hours and getting our practice in. But it was fun to do this with you all. Remember, you take your test. You got 3 times to take it. Don't fail. Good luck.
Bye, guys. Be safe.